So this is a event organized, sponsored by the Center on Religion and the Chinese Society at Purdue University. My name is Fenggang Yang. I'm the director of the Center on Religion and Chinese Society and also a professor of sociology at Purdue. The center has existed for 10 years, so this is the 10th year. We have a series of celebration events. So if you see this on the table, you can feel free to take one that lists some of the events, some of the things we have done in the last 10 years. And today, the special event is a guest lecture, a talk by Professor Jeffrey Wasserstrom. And Professor Wasserstrom is a Chancellor's Professor of History at the University of California, Irvine. He is not strange to Indiana. He taught at the Indiana University in Bloomington for some years before moved to California. During his time in IU, we had the opportunity to meet each other on the campus of Indiana University. And I have followed Professor Wasserstrom's work closely, and he is a prolific author. He has published several books and published many articles, and he is also he's a historian who is very up to date about things going on in China. He often writes commentaries, koans, and those short pieces commenting on current events that have some historical background that he could provide the insight. So, and he is very active as a scholar and as an observer of China. And he is also the editor of the Journal of Asian Studies, the flagship journal in Asian Studies, the Association for Asian Studies journal. So really, we are very happy to have Professor Wasserstrom to give this talk, focusing on the title, on the Confucius in the last 100 years in China, the fate of Confucius. I want to mention again other things. We have Professor Wasserstrom's book, the recent book on China in the 21st century, what everyone needs to know about China. And actually, it's a very, very good reading, very easy to understand, but also very serious scholarly work. So we have adopted that in my class this semester as a very good reading. It look like easy. There are questions raised, then he answers the questions. But all the answers are very carefully phrased, very carefully, really, it's a craftsman, I would say. Easy to understand, but with solid scholarship. So let's welcome Professor Wasserstrom.
Thanks. It's a real pleasure to be back here. I noticed there was a scowl when there was a mention that I taught at Indiana University. I know it's a great rival, but I have close friends in West Lafayette, so I would come to West Lafayette a lot, so I have ties here too. It's kind of intimidating as a historian who doesn't mostly focus on religion to be presenting in front of one of the people that I read to understand about Chinese religion. But so when I was going to have a topic for this, it seemed to deal with Confucius seemed to be the thing that would make sense. And in the writing that I do about the present, even though I write about the past and then I am interested in the present, but when I write about the present, I try to remind people of how it fits in with the past. So even though the book is called China in the 21st Century, What Everyone Needs to Know, the first question that's asked is, who was Confucius? What did he believe? And then, was he always revered in China? It's important because he wasn't always revered in China, even though the Chinese Communist Party would now like you to think that they've always celebrated Confucius. In fact, until 10 years ago, and until 20 years ago, there was a lot of distance held with Confucius. Certainly under Mao's time, there was actually criticism of Confucius. And then there were a series of moves to rehabilitate Confucius. Not the first time this had happened. To raise him up to a kind of status of a kind of national saint, which the Chinese Communist Party now has done. They even have Confucius Institutes that spread the word of Chinese culture around in different places. Which is to say it's partly modeled on things like the Goethe Institute that Germany has, and other places have institutes named after a thinker or somebody who represents a country. Confucius may seem like an obvious person to represent China, but actually in Mao's day, if they had started institutes like this to spread, well, Mao, he might have just called them Mao Institutes to just focus on his own writing, but if he hadn't, he might have thought of Lu Xun, China's greatest modern writer. If you were thinking of a counterpart to Goethe, you might have Lu Xun Institutes. Lu Xun, 100 years ago, next month, published his most famous short story, Diary of a Madman, which was an excoriation of Confucian ideas. It was a claim that Confucianism had held China backward, and it was actually a terrible kind of immoral code masquerading as a moral code. So 100 years ago, intellectuals were criticizing Confucius. Then he rose, just to give you the arc of this, he was rehabilitated and raised to the status of a kind of national saint in the 1930s. And then he fell again under Mao and was excoriated again. And then he rose again. So one of the places he rose, one of the signs of just how far he'd risen, was during the opening ceremonies of the Olympics in 2008, 10 years ago, same time around that this institute was founded. The opening ceremonies began with a quote from Confucius, "What a pleasure it is to welcome friends from afar." And at a display in the ceremony, one thing was 2008 actors dressed up to be disciples of Confucius. So it began with this idea of sort of having Confucius being where things all began. And that would be, again, it would seem normal that a country would take the most famous philosopher and celebrate that way. But if Mao's ghosts were hovering over the Olympics and looking down and said like, oh, my country, the country I founded, the People's Republic of China, is finally getting to host the Olympics, and what, they're quoting Confucius, he would have been very mystified. His arch rival, Chiang Kai-shek, who he defeated in 1949, Chiang Kai-shek's ghosts were hovering as a friend, Brana Mitter, a historian, another historian of China, wrote in around the time of the Olympics, just before, that you could imagine Mao's ghost and Chiang Kai-shek's ghost looking down on China about them and wondering which side had really won. And signs like Confucius being celebrated might have made Chiang Kai-shek think that actually his team was back in power. When I wrote about this at the time of the Olympics, I said one of the things that the Olympic commentators always love, the kind of story they love about athletes, is an athlete who was the best in their field and then suffered an injury, and then somehow miraculously comes back and wins a trophy. They love stories of the comeback kid. And I was joking and saying that Confucius really was the ultimate comeback kid of the 2008 Olympics. But none of the commentators really mentioned that because there's been an effort to forget a lot of parts about the Chinese past and to forget about the way in which the Chinese past has been thought about differently in different times, to try to give you the idea that there's nothing that strange about a party being a communist party, but also revering Confucius. So what I want to do is focus on bringing the history in different ways and revisit the things I've just told you about Confucius being criticized and being celebrated, then being criticized and now being celebrated again. And I'll talk about different ways to think about that. So one thing I like to do is I give, inevitably, people who travel around giving talks often use some elements of the same talks in different places. It's only natural. But I like to always say, when you're hearing me, there's something about where you're hearing me and when you're hearing me. There's something about this talk being given at this particular point in time and this particular place. It turns out to be very easy, though we didn't plan this, to talk about why this moment in time is a good time to talk about Confucius. Today is the Qingming Festival. April 5th, it falls at different times in April, but it's usually around now, and it is today. And it's a time when you sweep the graves of your ancestors. It's a time of revering the past and celebrating your actual relatives and ancestors, but also your sort of spiritual ancestors, people who you think of as being connected to in the past. So it becomes, in part, Confucian beliefs were a part about honoring your own ancestors, and Confucius himself has become a kind of great ancestor of the Chinese people in this. So here's Xinhua, the Chinese official news service, talking about this is Qingming Festival time to commemorate the deceased. Hold on. All right, this is just a photograph of last year's Qingming celebration, where just a lot of gravestones decorated. It's a time that you pay homage, you sweep clean the graves of your ancestors, and also you bring things to show your respect for them. So this is celebrated now in the People's Republic of China, but it's only been officially celebrated in the PRC for 10 years. Again, another 10th anniversary. The first celebration of official Qingming, this is China Daily, it's the official English language newspaper, saying in 2008 that because of popular demand, this had the Communist Party decided to add 3 holidays to the calendar. The calendar in the People's Republic of China from 1949 on, the holidays were almost all political anniversaries of dates in the history of the Chinese Revolution. So it was a giant step. Under Mao, those were the only kinds of days that were holidays, from the Chinese Revolution or from international revolutions. So International Women's Day was a holiday, International Labor Day was a holiday, the May 4th was Youth Day, which was the anniversary of the biggest student movement of 1919. There were other days like this. The anniversary of the founding of the Chinese Communist Party was a holiday. National Day, October 1st, the founding of the country. So it was quite a move in 2008. It suggested something about the post-Mao order to raise a traditional date to that. So that's why April 5th is a particularly apt day to be giving this particular talk. So why is it particularly apt to be giving it here? Well, today in the news, along with there being things about Qingming, there was news that online sales of Bibles were banned in China. It's been off and on whether the Bible has been banned. And so the article up here about that is by Ian Johnson, who spoke in this series last week. And you can buy his book. I highly recommend his book. It's for sale there, for sale here. And when he writes about this story, he quotes somebody at one point down in the bottom from Purdue University. He quotes Yang Fenggang. So you have kind of double meaning, and his book is for sale. So this is a particularly apt moment in time and place to be talking about Confucius's fall and rise and fall and rise. And so one of the things I'll just mention about the cover of this book, and it's gone through 3 different editions. It came out in 2010 and came out in 2013, and it's just been updated now for 2018. But what's consistent in it is the top picture and the bottom picture show a study of contrasts. They show at the top is a picture of a punk rock concert, fans at a punk rock concert in the early 21st century. And at the bottom is a picture, a slightly different picture in different editions, of members of the Chinese Communist Party all dressed identically and presumably voting in unison about something, or all on the same page. The idea that contrast, in part personally, is that I first went to China in 1986, 87. It was this very interesting moment. It was post-Mao, but pre-consumerism. China was just being connected to other parts of the world. Youth culture in China was still very different from youth culture other places. Popular culture was very disconnected, even though it was starting to connect. There was only one Hollywood movie shown the entire year I lived there. And unfortunately, it was Superman, which I'd seen before coming. And now, you can see movies, many of the movies that are popular here are popular there, and so forth. So the top picture, which shows the youth at a punk rock concert with dyed hair, sort of in step with global youth terms, was the kind of thing I didn't see anything of in China in 1986, and that you wouldn't have seen anything of if you were in any part of the world governed by a communist party. The bottom picture was just what you would see then and you still see now, which is basically a communist party in control, in unison. So what this suggests is that one of the big things about how China has changed in the last 30 years is it's become very connected with the world when it comes to some things, such as popular culture and entertainment, and also things of consumerism. There were no McDonald's there when I was there. There were McDonald's all the time, all over the place. There are Starbucks. There are Japanese ramen places everywhere. It's become much more connected to the world, but still politically, it's in some ways still, in many ways, what it was. Although there are also changes. So the idea of what's changed and what hasn't in the last 30 years is a key theme in the book. And religion is an interesting thing to think about because this is a story of both change and continuity. When it comes to the online sale of Bibles and the Qingming celebration, shows you something about change and continuity. The banning of online sales, the Bible, which comes and goes, is a sign that the Chinese Communist Party is obsessed with control, and it doesn't like organizational things that it can't control. So it's worried about things like it's very worried about Catholicism. There's an official version of Catholicism with bishops that can't accept the supremacy of the Pope. That can be accepted, but Catholicism that does accept the supremacy of the Pope can't be accepted. So there's a lot of ways, though, in which some things have changed, though. There's a lot more space made for religious belief. The Chinese Communist Party, in some ways, has tried to figure out a way to stay in power by allowing people more freedom in their private life and their personal life, but then keeping control of anything that verges into a kind of public life that could threaten monopoly on power. So the story of both allowing Qingming and trying to sort of have it be ways that people can worship in more traditional ways, while at the same time periodically clamping down on some kinds of religious belief, tells you about difference and about continuity. There's much more space for religious activity of some kinds and religious belief than under Mao, but there is also a desire for complete control in the end. This is a picture of a Confucius statue at a Confucius Institute that I happened to visit in Rome. Confucius statues were something I didn't see any of in China in 1986. Confucius was not being criticized, but he had not been completely rehabilitated at that point. The only statues you saw, not that many, of a godlike figure, were leftover ones of Mao, who had stopped being quite as much of a godlike figure, but still had the large statues. Now you sometimes find Mao statues and Confucius statues together. This was actually a photo taken in Qufu, Confucius's hometown, which during Mao's day was attacked as a symbol of feudal backwardness, and there were times when Red Guards attacked the ancestral cemetery of Confucius, and things like that. But now it's being turned into a theme park kind of thing, which people visit. The idea is to hopefully bring tourists from around East Asia and from the Chinese diaspora around the world to come there to reconnect, to think of it as a connection to the past. But the souvenir stores there kind of promiscuously have statue of Mao, statue of Confucius, statue of Buddha, a book by Mao, a little red book by the Analects of Confucius, all kind of jumbled together, which is part of the story of China today, is this jumbling together of different influences. Now, one of the things that's changed, and some of these changes are about things that are completely new, like the punk rock scene and Hollywood movies everywhere, but some are returns to what had happened in China and disappeared. And actually, even the Hollywood movie thing is a return. In the 1930s, Hollywood movies would play in Shanghai. Hollywood stars would visit Shanghai. Charlie Chaplin went there. And then there was a period when, under Mao, not only was Confucius considered dangerous, Hollywood movies were considered dangerous and decadent, and now there's been a kind of return to that. But another kind of return, different things. Under Mao, you saw his face everywhere, you saw his books everywhere, but I didn't get to China until Mao was dead. I'd been dead for 10 years. In 1986, the most powerful person in China was Deng Xiaoping. You didn't see his picture places, you didn't see statues of him everywhere. You didn't see his book in the bookstores everywhere. There was an effort to move away from personality cult kind of leadership under Mao. The idea was that was a mistake. Mao wasn't completely repudiated. There was an official verdict that he was 70% right, 30% wrong. But everybody kind of knew without it being spelled out that 30% wrong was the Cultural Revolution and the period when his personality cult got out of hand. So leaders in that period, Deng Xiaoping and after him, Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao, the idea was to play down anything about them that was kind of too charismatic. To just have them be the first among equals, a kind of rule by committee idea. They were powerful, but they were part of a group, not their individuals. And the speeches that Jiang Zemin gave, or the slogans and the writings they did, figures like Deng Xiaoping, Jiang Zemin, and Hu Jintao, their books of their collected speeches didn't come out until after they had stepped down from power, or in Deng Xiaoping's case, died. Then it was okay. Then you could celebrate them because it wasn't dangerous that they would become a kind of all-powerful demigod type figure the way Mao had been, and the way Stalin before him, and so forth. But now if you go to China, you see in the bookstores, the first thing you see is Xi Jinping's books. You see these kind of memorabilia with Xi Jinping's face everywhere. You see things that are a kind of reminder of Mao. And it's not a little red book, but it's a big white book on Xi Jinping, which is Governments of China that came out of his early speeches. And then they come out with a second edition, The Governance of China, Volume 2. These are not for sale here. And I wouldn't really recommend them as entertaining reading. They're just collections of his speeches. They're interesting. They're worth understanding about them. They're apparently, many copies are in distribution, but it's unclear how many are sold because a lot of them are given away as part of the spread of his ideas and China's and the story of China from Beijing's perspective. So Confucius Institutes will have Confucius's text and will also have Xi Jinping's distributed. But now this is a kind of partial return to something that had gone away. So most recently, one of the things that's returned, and this is, I'll be coming back to Confucius, but now we'll move away from him for a little while. One of the things that's returned that had been gone for a while, Mao Zedong was going to be leader basically for his whole life. He was leader until he died. He picked chosen successors, but then he would periodically fall out with them. So there was this uncertainty about what would happen after he stepped down. And then in the 1980s, the Chinese Communist Party, in trying to figure out, they said, we don't want to have this personality cult thing. We want to have a more stable, more orderly form of system. And we want to have clear modes of succession. So they came up with this idea that leaders should lead for 10 years, 2 5-year terms as head of the Communist Party, which is where the power really comes from, and as president of the country. So it was written into the Constitution that presidents could only be presidents for 2 5-year terms. Jiang Zemin was president, became president, and had the Communist Party. And he's at 5 years into his time, he designated a successor, Hu Jintao. 5 years later, he stepped down, Hu Jintao became leader. And that was the most orderly succession that had ever taken place in virtually any kind of authoritarian state without elections and things like that. It was very orderly. And then 5 years into Hu Jintao's term, he and the people around him designated Xi Jinping as the next leader. And then there was a little bit of, there was a scandal, there was tension, and it wasn't clear Xi Jinping would take over, but then he did. Hu Jintao stepped down. In 2012, Xi Jinping became head of the Communist Party. Early in 2013, he became president. The idea was that would be for 10 years. But just earlier this year, they amended the Constitution so that presidents don't have to just serve for 5-year terms. That Xi Jinping could potentially be president for life. And that shifted the way people have been talking about Xi Jinping and thinking about Xi Jinping. Until then, people had said, is he most like Deng Xiaoping or is he most like Hu Jintao? Which kind of reform era leader is he like in this new era that we've entered into that's not like Mao era? Now people are trying to say maybe we're in a new era, and Xi Jinping has talked about there being a new era. And this seems to be one where there might be a president for life. So how do we think about Xi Jinping? One way to think about him is as a Chinese answer to Vladimir Putin, who's a strongman leader, who talks about reviving his country's past glories, has a combative attitude toward the West, toward the United States at times, and seems to be set on staying in power as long as he feels like it. Though in his case, it's by changing titles and he does stand for elections. It's not a perfect analogy. There is no perfect analogy for Xi Jinping. He's not just like anybody else. But that's one of the things that's in the mix now that wasn't in the mix just a while ago. Another thing that people have started to say is maybe we're back in the Mao era again. Maybe Xi Jinping is a new Mao. And this is just something from Twitter that Wall Street Journal's correspondent Josh Chin wrote about, that he quoted people saying, we're regressing to the period of Cultural Revolution. It's like the Deng Xiaoping era never happened. Like the period of reform and open up didn't do anything. It's saying that the end of this regularity and predictability was taking China back to another period. Some people have said it's taking it back even further than just to the period of Mao. And actually, ever since Xi Jinping took power, there were signs that he was maximizing power. He was taking on more and more roles, not just president and head of the Communist Party, and head of the main military commission, which all of his immediate predecessors had been, but also styled himself as commander-in-chief, which hadn't been a term used in this way. Heads of many, many committees, people couldn't keep track of them. Jeremy Barmay, an Australian China specialist, said we should just call him chairman of everything, because it was too hard to keep track of them all. So and some people said it was like he wanted to be a new emperor. And also, Xi Jinping talked a lot about trying to restore China to the period of greatness that it had under the last of the powerful emperors it had. China had powerful emperors for many centuries before the 1840s, when it began to lose wars with foreign powers. So Xi Jinping has talked about overseeing a great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation that's returning it to what's seen as the position it had during the early part of the Ching Dynasty, sort of around 1800. So that's when The Economist said let's party like it's 1793, with this picture of him in his regalia. Some people, this is a cartoonist from outside of China, said he's kind of like Mao, he's kind of like an emperor. So they came up with this drawing that Xi Jinping dressed like an emperor, but with his face, the portrait Tiananmen, looking out from Tiananmen Gate, which is where Mao's portrait has always been. And one thing you know, well, when the Olympics were being held 10 years ago, the television would say, you're in China. They would show a shot of the Great Wall. When they say, you're in the People's Republic of China, they'd show a shot of the Mao portrait up by Tiananmen. So this is blending those together, saying Xi Jinping is like an emperor and he's like Mao. And Mao in his day was said to be like an emperor. Now this can only be done outside of China. Inside of China, you cannot mock Xi Jinping, at least not directly. People on the internet find creative ways to try to express things that they can't express legally. So one of the things they've done is people have noted that Xi Jinping, in some photographs, looks a little bit like Winnie the Pooh. He's a bit portly, and when he met with Barack Obama, who was very tall, the two of them were walking around. There was a meme that went online that showed Winnie the Pooh walking with Tigger. It had the two of them that way. And so this was something that It then got even more viral when Xi Jinping met with Abe, the head of Japan, and the two of them looked like they really didn't want to be there, especially Abe. So they had Winnie the Pooh and Eeyore. So that was, and then periodically Winnie the Pooh will get banned online, but actually it's harder to ban. It's getting easier, but words are very easy for censors to pick out. Images can be harder to pick out. So when it was announced that Xi Jinping would no longer be limited to 10 years, there started being images of Winnie the Pooh wearing a crown. So this is this idea, which, it's not new. There have been times when earlier leaders of the Chinese Communist Party were compared to emperors, even though the Chinese Communist Party said what it is totally unlike. It wanted to see itself as making a total break from the imperial period. There were foreign analysts who sometimes said, look how emperor-like those figures are. The same thing happened with Stalin. Stalin was called a new czar, even though the whole point of the Russian Revolution was to do away with czars. But of course, there's a long tradition of thinking that revolutions create leaders suspiciously like the leaders of the past, that they're supposed to be completely unlike. Animal Farm by George Orwell is the kind of classic thing of that. So, what I want to talk about in part, using Confucius to get around, is that actually all of those analogies give you some purchase on what Xi Jinping's like. Thinking of him as being like an emperor, there's some value to that. Think of him being like Mao, there's some value to that. Think of him being like Putin, there's some value. Each of them also have problems with him. So actually it's good to think of multiple people that he's sort of like. And I want to add one more into the mix, which is this guy, Chiang Kai-shek, who would seem an odd person to compare a Communist Party leader to, because Chiang Kai-shek was a diehard anti-communist. He was head of the Nationalist Party, which struggled with the Communist Party for control of China. And in 1949, the Communists won and took control of the mainland. Chiang Kai-shek went into exile on Taiwan, which then became the Republic of China, and a new People's Republic was made on the mainland. The two men, Chiang Kai-shek and Mao, stayed arch enemies until they both died in the mid-1970s, and both of their countries have changed dramatically since then, but in different ways. But I want to suggest that in certain ways, well, again, it's not a perfect analogy, having him also, Xi Jinping in some ways, being a throwback to Chiang Kai-shek as well as a throwback to emperors, is an interesting thing to fit in. And the fact that they both admire Confucius is one of the connected threads. So, I've mentioned the Ching Dynasty. It began in 1644. This won't be on the quiz, don't worry. And then 1898, there were a set of reforms that I'm going to mention briefly. Even going back 100 years to 1918, I've mentioned that. In Chinese numerology, one of the other kinds of periods that's important are 60-year cycles and 120-year cycles. This is the 120th anniversary of the 1898 reforms, so I'm going to mention them. 120th anniversary in Chinese reckoning is like a bicentennial. So it's one of those times you say, look what was happening 60 years ago or 120 years ago. So a few years ago, one sign of this, in 2014, in the United States and in Britain, there were tons of books being published about the 100th anniversary of the start of World War I. In China, if you went into a Chinese bookstore in the history section, that year there were lots of books being published about the 120th anniversary of the Sino-Japanese War of 1894-95. We had that same kind of balance. And the idea was Japan beat us then, but that could never happen now. Look how much things have changed in 120 years. The 1898 reforms, just because I haven't mentioned them yet, it was a moment when China was still under imperial rule, and some scholars got the attention of the emperor and tried to convince him that the way for China to move forward in the world and to become stronger after having been defeated by foreign powers was to do something a bit like what Japan had done with the Meiji Restoration, where they kept an emperor in control, but they modernized a lot of their political system, borrowing from different parts of the West. And what these intellectuals said is we should think of Confucianism as something that we keep. We should think of Confucianism as something that goes along with modernization. And we should think of a kind of, Confucius was actually a reformist figure, not just a traditional figure. They had this idea, intellectuals were celebrating Confucius, but saying he could be combined with elements of of the West and modernity to create something new and distinctively Chinese. Conservatives within the Ching Dynasty, this would have moved toward a constitutional monarchy and things like that, and changed the traditional examinations of conservatives in the dynasty moved against the emperor and basically put him under house arrest, and the intellectuals went into exile, or some of them were killed, who were pushing for these reforms. So there was a move away from reform and toward more kind of hardening up on the style of control, which then led the Qing dynasty into a kind of tailspin until, after further defeats by foreign powers in 1900, they finally started to reform, but it was too little too late. In 1911, they're overthrown by a revolution. A few years after the revolution, something begins called the New Culture movement, where intellectuals at that point said, we've had a political revolution, but we don't seem to have really become a strong society. China had devolved into warlord rule. They said maybe the problem is that there's something fundamentally wrong in the culture. Maybe we need not just a political revolution, but something to change the culture. And they identified Confucian ideas as one of the things holding China back. So there was a New Culture movement which reached one peak in 1918, the publication of this famous short story I mentioned, Diary of a Madman, which Lu Xun imagines this man who thinks of, he's mad, but he sees the world clearly, which is one idea that people have sometimes. And he sees that actually traditional culture is riddled with these ideas holding China back, and it needs a kind of purging of all Confucian traditions. Around that same New Culture movement, there was a young guy named Mao Zedong, who was inspired by ideas from around the world, and he wrote some early essays attacking the Confucian marriage system as something that kept women repressed, and he also said there needed to be changes from tradition. Other people thought there were other kinds of changes. So there was an anti-Confucian moment. So, and then we move forward in time. So this is Liang Qichao, famous intellectual related to the Reform movement. This is Xinjiang, the major magazine of the New Culture movement that carried a lot of things by the leading intellectuals of the day, attacking Confucianism as incompatible with modernity. Rather than saying you could combine it, we have to do a wholesale ridding of China of that. There was a big student movement during the New Culture movement, the May 4th movement, which is celebrated as Youth Day in China now. And the Communist Party sees it as one of the things that laid the groundwork for the founding of the Communist Party. This openness to new ideas, criticism of Confucianism. Then Russia stood out as the model for a new kind of way to move forward, just as Japan had earlier. And some of the members in the New Culture movement founded the Communist Party. This is Lu Xun, the anti-Confucian and anti-authoritarian heroic writer, who was then celebrated. He died, luckily he died before having to completely choose sides. And he was sympathetic to the Communist Party, but didn't actually join it. But he could then be claimed by the Communist Party as a radical thinker and lead with them. Even though Mao later admitted if Lu Xun had lived after 1949, he probably would have ended up in a prison camp for his ideas. But he's celebrated in posters from the Mao era as a great thinker. So then the 1930s happened, and Chiang Kai-shek, late 1920s, Chiang Kai-shek, head of the Nationalist Party and Communist Party worked together for a little while, but then they fell out under Chiang Kai-shek. Chiang Kai-shek attacked the communists and celebrated Confucius and said, once again, that modernity could be combined with Confucian tradition. And he started something called the New Life movement, in which he claimed that what China needed was to reconnect with its traditional values, Confucianism, respect for age, respect for tradition, family, orderliness, and needed to resist the communists who stood for the opposite of that, stood for disorder and so forth. And so after 1949, Mao's revolution, among other things, Mao puts himself and the party in the role of family as what you should admire. So this would be a family scene where you would, in an earlier period perhaps, have had a picture of your familial ancestor. Here you have Mao. And when people would get married, instead of bowing before their parents, they would bow before pictures of Mao. So there was a way in which the religion became, to some extent, Maoism. And there were a key part of this, and the heyday of Maoism was an attack on both dangerous forms of foreign ideas and dangerous forms of traditional Chinese ideas. This was during the Four Olds campaign, in which there was just a smashing of all the dangerous influences that need to be kept out of China. And it's a sledgehammer being taken, and we see below there, it's a little hard to make out, but there's a phonograph record that probably, some of you probably don't remember phonograph records, but anyway, it was before there was streaming music, you would have to play this. Anyway, but this is being smashed, which presumably was like Western dangerous music like jazz or rock, bourgeois decadent things. There's also a picture of a Buddhist statue, and there's a crucifix. So these are like all the pernicious influences, everything that's not part of the communist tradition, part of the Maoist tradition within China, is dangerous to be kept out. It was a kind of fundamentalist movement that wanted to say that only things that were pure. So this was all being attacked, and Confucius was being attacked at the same time. Confucius, there were posters that would show enemies of the Chinese Communist Party being shown as caricatures to be mocked. There were pictures just like this that showed larger-than-life socialist heroes attacking, by this time China and the Soviet Union call it, Soviet revisionists that were mocked, or American capitalists that were mocked, or Confucians, or Confucian ideas, or Buddhists. So that's a picture, a mocking of the sage being there. And Taiwan at that point, under Chiang Kai-shek, celebrated Confucius and actually said one reason why they tried to convince people around the world to support Taiwan versus Beijing as the rightful repository of Chinese culture and tradition was that they revered Confucius and celebrated his birthday, whereas on the mainland they attacked him. So this was from 1973 during the heyday of some attacks on Confucius on the mainland. Taiwan spreading itself. I mean, we could imagine Chiang Kai-shek, if he thought of it, would have started Confucius Institutes to try to spread respect for Taiwan. He didn't think of it. But he did hold celebrations of Confucius' birthday. This is just more of the same story that talks about Chiang Kai-shek's wife being overseeing the celebration of Confucius' birthday. And then, flash forward, Confucius is back in favor by 2008, the Olympics, as one of the great moments for his return. And then, again, this is an article from 2008 talking about how Chinese officials have rediscovered Confucius, and they're coming up with this for the third time, 1898, 1930s, and the recent past, saying, actually you can combine new modern ideas with traditional Confucian ones into a package that is in step with global trends, but is distinctively Chinese. Xi Jinping takes this to the nth degree after he's in power, and there are books out, Xi Jinping, How to Read Confucius and Other Chinese Classical Thinkers. And to read just one example from what he writes, you've got to remember that Mao said, everything I believe is incompatible with Confucius. You have to choose between Confucian ideas and Marxist and Maoist ideas. And the only place that they are believing in Confucian ideas is across the strait in that horrible place, what he viewed Taiwan, which is under misrule where they celebrate Confucius. Come forward to Xi Jinping, who claims to be and expresses admiration for Mao, gave speeches on Mao's 120th anniversary of Mao's birth, extolling Mao as a great leader, but also says good things about Confucius. So he says, here's one from a speech he gave in January of 2016. He said, in nature, the philosophy of shared development represents the idea of people-centered development. It reflects the demand of achieving shared prosperity in stages. Shared prosperity is a primary goal of Marxism. It has also been a basic ideal of the Chinese people since ancient times. Confucius said, he is not concerned lest his people should be poor, but only lest what they should have be ill apportioned. He is not concerned lest they should be few, but only lest they should be divided against one another. Mencius, the second greatest Confucian philosopher, said, quote, do reverence to the elders in your own family and extend it to those in other families. Show loving care to the young in your own family and extend it to those in other families. The Book of Rights, a Confucian classic, gives a detailed and lively description of moderate prosperity and great harmony. The next paragraph, according to Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, communism will eradicate the opposition and differentiation between classes. So he's saying there's no contradiction between Marxist ideas, communist ideas, and Confucian ideas, even though for most of the 20th century, the one thing that people would have agreed on both sides of this divide was that you had to choose between Confucianism and Marxism. You couldn't have them both. Going backward in time, and forward in time, just like the top. So here is a shot of the idea, the books of Mao's Little Red Book by Confucius's Little Red Book. The Lunyu, the Analects of Confucius, are actually a small collection of very aphoristic little short things, which Mao's Little Red Book is an aphoristic collection of very short things. So there's some ways in which, even though they were opposites, there are some ways in which Mao was taking the place of Confucius, or trying to be put in place. But now they're being combined in a kind of promiscuous historical fashion. And this is another photograph from my visit to Confucius's hometown, and it shows a poster that I think pulls together the way in which the Chinese Communist Party would like you to think of where they're taking the PRC, which is to become a modernistic, a state-of-the-art technological place, image of the bullet train, the super fast train, that China now has this amazing high-speed rail network, and yet it's in touch with its Confucian past. So, broad ideas that I want to get across to you is there are two issues, I think. There are two problems with thinking about China that continually reappear in foreign ideas about it, and Chinese ideas about it sometimes. One is an idea of a changeless China, that China has always been, that has 5,000 years of uninterrupted history. This is something that official statements will often be made within China, and outside of China, people will say two things like, well, what's special about China is you can go back thousands of years and you've got continuity. The problem with that is when you hear China and you see a map like that in your mind, hasn't been around for 5,000 years in anything like that shape. And when you think about 5,000 years of unbroken tradition, you're encouraged to think that Confucius has always been revered, whereas I just showed you that in the last century, he's been up and down, up and down, up and down. And you think of China as just being one thing, when actually there are multiple traditions within China, multiple religious traditions, different ethnic traditions, different linguistic traditions. China is not a single entity going for thousands of years. It's a little bit like saying the West has thousands of years of history. You can go back to Greece and Rome. We don't imagine that the physical shape of Greece and Rome is still now what the political shape is, but we fall into that trap with China and are encouraged to by the Confucius states and things like that. So here's this supposedly changeless China. These are just maps that show you the size of what the emperor of a different dynasty would actually control. And so you have only under the Qing does it become the kind of size that whole pink is, whereas the red is the size that it was during most of the Ming Dynasty, just before the Qing. So it's much, much smaller. And at other points, there were some times when there were multiple emperors that would claim to be ruling over China. Similarly, the Great Wall is seen as this image that takes you back thousands of years, when in fact, the Qing emperor 2,000 some odd years ago built a wall that was pretty good, but it wasn't nearly as long as what we imagined. It didn't look like what we imagined. The wall that we now see, the shot of the Great Wall, was actually created in about the 15th, 16th century. And there were times when all that China was part below the wall, there were parts when it was below the wall and above the wall, there were parts when it didn't go nearly as far in as the wall went. So there's a risk of thinking of this changeless China, and one of the things to try to destabilize with a talk like this is that idea of enduring changeless China. Everything has been up for grabs. You can find continuities, but you can also find breaks, the same way you can within the Western tradition. But another illusion is to think that at one moment, everything changed completely. And that also is a trap that Westerners have sometimes fallen into. There was an idea that once Mao took power, suddenly everything was new, rather than some things carrying over from the past. Or in 1911, when the dynasty fell, suddenly everything was new. And there actually is a lot of bleed over between periods, which Confucius also shows you. And sometimes Confucius being brought down and coming back shows you the bleeding over from things can come in very surprising ways, like there being similarities between Chiang Kai-shek, leader of an anti-communist party, and Xi Jinping, head of a communist party. So here is one idea. So Mao, in this idea of a complete break, Mao was no longer connected to any thinkers of China's past, but he was just following in a new kind of lineage of Marxists. But there are problems with this idea of complete rupture from 1949, and here's one. The picture of Mao's portrait by Tiananmen is one of the symbols of China since 1949. But actually, Chiang Kai-shek's face was up there before 1949. And before Mao had a personality cult, Chiang Kai-shek had a personality cult. And there are many things that were connected between them, even though they were different. Chiang Kai-shek was anti-communist, but he wasn't anti-Leninist. He actually admired the one-party disciplined control of the Soviet Union. He admired the Soviet Union's anti-imperialism. He just thought that the revolution should be by a party that had tight control, that was anti-imperialist, and was in touch with Chinese traditional values. Things that pretty much fit with Xi Jinping's thought now. But Mao and Chiang Kai-shek had certain things in common. And one thing they had in common was they both admired Sun Yat-sen, the leader of the 1911 revolution, and both of them claimed to be carrying over on the tradition. Chiang Kai-shek literally succeeded Sun Yat-sen as head of the Nationalist Party. But over there, the picture shows an early celebration in the People's Struggle of China in the 1950s, where they showed people carrying Mao's portrait and Sun Yat-sen's portrait. And actually, one of the things the communists said you could tell was bad about the nationalists before 1949 was they had let Sun Yat-sen's home in Shanghai fall into disrepair rather than keep the shrine up the way you would an ancestor you revered. So another kind of just general concept, which I'll just end with, is history doesn't repeat itself. Things are always different, and each of the revivals of Confucius have been different from the last one. But there's a saying that's attributed to Mark Twain, and he's my favorite American writer, so I always find a way to slip him in. It's attributed to him, but he probably didn't say it, which many of the things that are attributed to him he probably didn't say. But the saying is history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. And what I like about that is a couple of things. It says that it's not exact repetition, but more than that, it says we think when you're rhyming words, you know that several words rhyme with any word. You know that there are several choices, and you're choosing, if you're writing a poem or a song, to pick one that rhymes, but there could have been others. And what that suggests is that when you're looking at any moment in history, kind of the op-ed-driven thing in newspapers, this isn't just about China. This would be when Trump was elected, people were saying, who is Trump like? Which figure from the past? And people would, there would be an op-ed that would say, if you want to understand Trump, he's just like Reagan, only with this difference. Or no, he's just like Andrew Jackson. Or there would be, or he's like Mussolini. I mean, it could go in many different directions. But the idea of it in a kind of soundbite-driven age is to find that one thing, as if there's one perfect analogy. When in fact, usually, the best we can do is find a few different things that all rhyme. And if we keep them all in mind, we have a richer picture of this. So I would say with this up and down in Confucius, even though they're different each time, they do rhyme, and that can help alert us to some of the things going on that are recurring patterns but not identical. Thanks for your attention. I look forward to your questions.